would hope that he can go into this in some detail. Now, the most important thing to me that we are dealing with in this country right now is the failure of the so-called war against drugs. We've spent more money, incarcerated more nonviolent people under an antiquated mandatory minimum sentence to less and less effect. 1.5 million people are arrested every year for drug violations. We spend $2 billion a year to imprison people who violate federal drug laws. We incarcerate more people than any other nation on the planet Earth. But the drug use in the U.S. and around the world is more prevalent than ever. And it is, if there was one thing that we could accomplish successfully between now and the next time the committee meets with the chief law enforcement officer of the country, is that we get on top of the drug problem.
Gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I asked you mentioned in my opening statement my support for Senator Webb's bill, which I believe Congressman Delahunt is the sponsor of here. Has the Justice Department done any, or intends to do any comprehensive looks at our sentencing laws and try to reform them so that they are in the 21st century?
One of the task forces that I put in place has looked at federal sentencing laws, and it is as a result of that again, there will be something issued very shortly from me to the field. We have looked at the Webb bill as modified, and it is one that the administration, again, as modified, now supports.
There was a April 22 federal district court sentencing ruling by Judge George Wu. Are you familiar with Judge Wu?
No, I'm not.
Well, he issued a 41-page written order concerning a man named Charles Lynch, who was convicted of medical marijuana dispensing. And in that opinion, he said much of the problem could be ameliorated by the reclassification of marijuana from Schedule 1. What are your thoughts that you could share with us about how the department will approach a rescheduling hearing of marijuana, which is right now in the highest class that the federal government knows, mean it's at a level with dilaudid, opium, heroin, as far as being habit-forming, addictive, and troublesome, and expensive, and bad, and all those other things?
Well, one has to look at, I think, the issue of marijuana in its totality. The Mexican cartels get the greatest amount of their revenue from the trafficking of marijuana. It is something that fuels, helps to fuel the violence that we've seen in Mexico. Is potentially something that can, the trafficking of this substance can have an effect on violence in the United States. What the administration has done is to say that in those states where a determination has been made that medical use can be made of marijuana, that we would not use our limited resources to go after marijuana being used in that way, but to focus our attention on those people who are major traffickers of marijuana and other drugs that have such a negative impact on so many communities in this country.
If I could ask the Chair for just 30 more seconds. Thank you, Madam Chair. On that subject, I concur with you and commend you on that, but I would like to suggest that possibly the reason that there's such a demand for that product that causes all the violence is because it's illegal. And maybe if it wasn't a Class 1, and maybe if there was some other determinations, maybe you would, and obviously it must be popular someplace with someone, and that's why maybe we should take into consideration the popularity and the demand, and maybe changing cultural norms and values, and maybe supply and demand, and we could reduce violence through another way than violence with violence and violence with incarceration, and instead kind of work our way through this, get to a higher place, so to speak.
Gentleman's time has expired. You have a response?
Well, I would only say that I think one of the things we ought to try to do is reduce demand for marijuana and other drugs. That will help our Mexican counterparts. It is, I think, the responsibility of the United States to try to do that. This administration has tried to do that through the use of drug courts and treatment, added money for treatment facilities, and I think that is the way in which we can decrease the amount of violence that we see.
The gentleman yields back his time. It gives me great pleasure again to yield to another distinguished new member of the committee, Mr. Polis from Colorado, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is with regard to federal the policy with regard to drug enforcement administration and marijuana policy, building off of what my colleague, Mr. Cohen, asked earlier. I certainly applauded and greet with warm welcome representing one of the states that has a medical marijuana law and regulates the sale of marijuana, the memo describing the intent of DA and U.S. attorneys. I'd like you to describe the objective processes that the DA and the U.S. attorneys are using in order to make a determination about whether individuals are in, quote, clear and unambiguous compliance with state law. How is that determined?
Well, it's done on a, people get, I guess, tired of hearing this, but it is true. It's done on a case-by-case basis. We look at the state laws and what the restrictions are, what the how the law is constructed, and then there are a number of factors in that memo that are guides. Is marijuana being sold consistent with state law? Are arms, are firearms somehow associated with the sale? There are a variety of factors that are contained within the memo that went out from the Deputy Attorney General that United States attorneys and assistant United States attorneys are supposed to apply, supposed to consider when trying to make the determination about whether or not federal resources are going to be used to go after somebody who is dealing in marijuana. I
would certainly encourage that the question of whether it's or not is consistent with state law certainly be left to state enforcement actions. In particular, I brought to your concern in a letter of February 23rd requesting a clarification of your policies regarding medical marijuana with regard to several statements that were made by one of your agents in Colorado, Jeffrey Sweeten, along the lines of the quote, as quoted in the paper, "The time is coming when we go into a dispensary, we find out what their profit is, we seize the building, and we arrest everybody. They're violating federal law. They're at risk of arrest and imprisonment," end quote. I would like to ask what steps you might take to make sure that the spirit of the enforcement mechanisms that you outlined to me in the answer to your previous questions are not contradicted by the statements of agents that in fact then strike fear into legitimate businesses in the eyes of our states.
Well, it's incumbent upon me as Attorney General to make sure that what we have set out as policy is being followed by all of the components within the Department of Justice, and to the extent that somebody at the DEA, somebody at some assistant United States attorney is not following that policy, it is my responsibility to make sure that the policy is clear, that the policy is disseminated, and that people act in conformity with the policies that we have determined.
Do you agree that statements that could be reasonably taken as threatening to businesses that are legal in our state are in fact contrary to your stated policy?
Well, again, if the entity is in fact operating consistent with state law and is not does not have any of those factors involved that are contained in that that Deputy Attorney General memo, and given again the limited resources that we have and our determination to focus on major traffickers, that would be inconsistent with what the policy as we have set it out.